Hi. In this video, I'd like to explore the nature of forgiveness. And here's the usual roadmap of the material in this video. You can find the same roadmap in the description section along with links to the timestamps. Anyhow, like I said, in this video, I'd like to focus on exploring the nature of forgiveness, which Webster's defines as to cease to feel resentment against an offender, to pardon. Of course, that's something we can do or not do when we feel like someone has wronged or betrayed us somehow and that we're owed something as a consequence, which incidentally is also why we speak of forgiving debts of various kinds. And so one way of starting to explore forgiveness would be to ask, when is it a good idea to forgive someone, to cease to feel resentment toward that person for a past offense, and when is it not a good idea? Of course, there's a line of reasoning that would say that forgiveness is a virtue that we should always exercise, irrespective of context. After all, as they say, to err is human, to forgive divine. But personally, I think that's just a little too simplistic. For instance, consider the phenomenon of recurrent domestic abuse, where the supposedly divine act of forgiveness often just perpetuates the cycle of pain and suffering. In that case, forgiveness isn't a virtue, but is actually part of the ongoing problem. So, all in all, I think it's a little too pat to say that we should always be forgiving, irrespective of the situation at hand. And more specifically, it seems to me that forgiveness is a bad idea when the resentment we'd be giving up is actually protecting us from some sort of reasonably imminent threat, as in the case of recurrent domestic abuse once again. And when you think about it, that's true of many of our darker emotions. You know, things like animosity, bitterness, detestation, antipathy, and even hate. Sure, they certainly seem like unpleasant negative experiences a lot of the time, but that doesn't mean that they're devoid of redeeming value. In fact, sometimes experiences like those serve very important functions in our lives. Basically, those sorts of dark emotions are there for a reason. And sometimes it's actually a very beneficial thing to hate, beneficial both to ourselves and to the world more generally. That's especially true when what we hate is threatening or debilitating somehow. But on the other hand, when we participate in our world's socially sanctioned charade that we should all be ashamed of our resentment and hatred and repress them in principle, it's really nothing more than a way of crippling one of our natural defensive coping mechanisms, a kind of emotional reaction that pushes us away from things that should probably repel us in the first place. The fact is that sometimes we actually need to be resentful, unforgiving monsters, and we deny that part of ourselves at our own peril. Of course, a lot of the time our resentments don't circulate around things that are posing any sort of imminent threat. Instead, a lot of our lingering resentments are about wounds and grievances we've suffered in the past and that aren't even remotely active threats in the present. And here's where it's wise to learn to forgive. After all, when the weight of our ancient resentments and grievances, together with all of the conceptual apparatus we use to justify and perpetuate them, isn't protecting or strengthening us somehow, then it's probably a good idea to let them go. That's because what's probably happening is that they've become little more than a source of ongoing toxification and debilitation in our lives, a kind of poisonous undercurrent in the wide ocean of our experience, always weakening us and dissipating our energies, always dragging us down below the surface into the murky, suffocating depths where the least noble and the least capable parts of ourselves can then rule us completely. Buddhists have a pretty apt way of characterizing the futility of that dynamic. They say, holding on to anger is like taking poison and expecting the other person to die. And so there comes a time to do whatever we can to flush that kind of poison out of our systems, especially when it's no longer serving any positive function in our lives. And forgiveness can be a way of doing that. And that gets at an aspect of forgiveness that people often overlook. The fact is that forgiving someone can be an incredibly greedy, selfish thing to do. But usually we don't think of it that way. Usually we think of it in terms of the giving of forgiving. Like we're giving someone a free pass, or perhaps giving away something when we do it. And at one level, that's probably true. When we forgive people, we're giving them a kind of pardon and releasing them from whatever sense of indebtedness we feel for past injuries. Basically, letting go of the sensation that they owe us something, all of which seems pretty generous and even altruistic. But the greedy part is that when we forgive, we no longer have to bear the burden of our resentments, and that can be an incredibly liberating, almost ecstatic sensation, especially when we've been holding on to them for a long time. In fact, I'd even say that forgiveness only becomes genuine when it's mostly an expression of our honest, selfish desire to better our lives, rather than some sort of overweening fantasy of superior moral rectitude. I also often think that a big part of what makes it difficult for us to forgive is that we're afraid that it will automatically grant people permission to mistreat us in the future. That we're basically turning ourselves into human doormats. And the unpleasant fact is that sometimes other people will interpret our forgiveness that way. After all, there are always plenty of predators in this world who will see forgiveness as a marker of weakness to be exploited. And it's good to be realistic about that. I'm sorry, but we just don't live in a wonderful candy land where every human being on the planet has our own best interests at heart. So I'd say that there's wisdom in being somewhat strategic about how and when we forgive people. And once again, sometimes it's better not to do it. But on the other side of the coin, often enough it is desirable to forgive, especially when we can enjoy the benefits of doing so. But even in those cases, forgiveness can be surprisingly difficult. But why? Especially when it involves offenses that are definitely in the distant past and that only end up toxifying our lives in the present. Basically, what makes forgiving other people so difficult beyond even our fears of being taken advantage of? Well, I think that the deep and somewhat disconcerting reason is that most of us actually cling pretty tenaciously to our suffering. Of course, that can be an extremely difficult thing to admit, most of all to ourselves. But that doesn't make it any less true. In fact, probably just the opposite, because a lot of the time our deepest truths are also the ones that are hardest to admit. And when you think about it, who would we really be without our suffering, without our pain, and without all of the myriad sources of torment and debilitation that seem to define our existence? How would we orient ourselves toward the world and toward life, if not by way of our grievances over past slights and injuries? It can be a very disconcerting set of questions that can easily make letting go of our suffering an extremely daunting challenge. After all, as the saying goes, better the devil you know than the devil you don't. Anyhow, if you don't believe that we human beings are deeply attached to suffering and even passionately in love with it a lot of the time, consider the broad panoply of history. For example, has it ever impressed you what a large fraction of history is basically an account of how we human beings consistently go out of our way to generate hell on earth? For instance, history's innumerable conflicts, wars, wholesale genocidal slaughter, indiscriminate torture, oppression of various types, generalized destruction and mayhem for no good reason, enslavement, totalitarian despotism, ideological insanity of types A through Z, etc., etc., et freaking cetera. God, you really have to hand it to the human race, don't you? We're endlessly creative and doggedly persistent when it comes to all of that. But why? Well, I suspect the reason is that underneath all of humanity's niceties and refinements, all of our soaring achievements and all of our breathless moments of transcendence and brilliance, underneath all of that, we're still in love. positively, madly, and deliriously in love with darkness and suffering. And that's why even a cursory reading of the historical record quickly reveals how frequently and consistently we go out of our way to generate more of it. But our attachment to suffering is also the reason why there's so much pain, self-destruction, addiction, disappointment, and betrayal, and general douchebaggery, for that matter, in the more everyday interpersonal sphere. That's not just an accident, neither in the macrocosm of history nor in the microcosm of everyday life, because underneath it all, it's what we human beings do. It's how we are, whether we like it or not. As Arnold Schwarzenegger once succinctly put it, it's in your nature to destroy yourselves. Or, as another Austrian phrased it several decades earlier, the human unconscious is a composite of eros and thanatos, which is to say the death drive. Oh, wait. That was Arnold's voice again. It was supposed to be Sigmund Freud. Anyhow, the point is that against that backdrop, a big part of what makes forgiveness so challenging is that it involves swimming upstream against our intense passion for its opposite, for generating even more suffering and dissolution and general hell on earth. And so, for most of us, forgiveness doesn't happen naturally or easily. Most of the time, it requires an unusual effort, especially if we're doing it honestly, rather than as a way of generating some sort of virtue signaling theater for ourselves, which actually happens quite often. But then the question becomes, okay, but is there something we can do to make forgiveness a little easier, especially when we're really struggling with it? Basically, how can we learn to let go of the pools of useless, enervating resentment that a lot of us are carrying around? Well, it seems to me that several things can make that process easier. Number one would be learning to recognize our own human shortcomings thoroughly and intimately, and giving up the project of endlessly trying to convince ourselves of our own quasi-moral correctness and superiority. That's helpful because when we recognize our own faults and failings, it can make it a lot easier to accept other people's shortcomings and then forgive them when the time is right to do so. In essence, our capacity to forgive ourselves for being what we are makes it a lot easier to forgive other people for being what they are, and vice versa. On the other hand, when we're nursing the virtue signaling fantasy of our own moral superiority, it's very easy to be unforgiving in our relationships with other people. Of course, it's quite a quantum leap for most of us to give up that habit and to become humble enough to acknowledge that we ourselves are frail and faulted, along with the people we're eager to condemn, and that we too consequently need to be forgiven sometimes. But the basic principle is that recognizing our own imperfections can definitely be a path toward learning to forgive them in others, and vice versa. For instance, the Lord's Prayer captures that reciprocal dynamic pretty well. It says, "Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us." The second thing that can make forgiveness a lot easier would be learning to understand other people rather than judge them. For instance, have you noticed how much easier it is to forgive other people when we really understand where they're actually coming from, even when they've hurt us in one way or another? Of course, that's not true all the time, but it is a lot of the time. However, the problem is that we don't usually go to the trouble to understand each other in the first place. In reality, understanding is a fairly rare thing in this world. Of course, most of us like to think that we're good at understanding other people, but a lot of the time that's little more than a form of self-congratulatory theater, because what we're really doing is first judging other people, usually in a lot of subtle and fairly automatic ways, and then confusing that judgmental activity with actual understanding. But in reality, understanding isn't about what we're usually doing, which is evaluating other people in terms of various hierarchical gradients, such as, do I like them or not? Or, what's their social or economic status? Or, what can they do for me? Etc., etc. In reality, understanding other people is about seeing things from their perspective as much as we humanly can, rather than about resting easily in the comfort zone of our own already existing values, agendas, and point of view. But of course, what that means is that in order to understand other people, we need to let go of a lot of the egoism of simply judging them from our own supposedly superior vantage points, which of course is a lot easier to say than to do, mostly because most of us tend to cling pretty tenaciously and desperately to the illusion of our own self-importance and superiority. But feeling self-important and superior makes it pretty hard to understand other people and to forgive them for their inevitable faults and foibles, and pretty easy to be ruthlessly judgmental instead. However, the third thing that can make forgiveness a lot easier has to do with our relation to life itself, and more specifically, with whether we're able to forgive life for all of the ridiculous hardships and hell it puts us through. Sure, as we noted earlier, a lot of the time we go out of our way to generate more and more suffering in this life, both for ourselves and for the people around us. But the thing is that all of that wouldn't be possible in the first place if life weren't structured as it is. If it weren't the case that life is suffering, as the Buddhists say. Personally, I call that kind of forgiveness existential forgiveness, because it has to do with forgiving existence for all of its inevitable pain and disappointment. Existential forgiveness isn't so much about pardoning person X or person Y or person Z who has somehow managed to injure or torment us. It has to do with forgiving life itself for being what it is. So then the question naturally becomes, how can we begin to do that? How can we begin to forgive life for being the occasion and context for all of our pain and anguish? And I think that at least part of the answer to that question has to do with something we noted in our initial definition of forgiveness at the beginning of this video. Namely, that it involves letting go of our sense of indebtedness. Basically, existential forgiveness involves letting go of the illusion that life owes us something. That it should be making us happy, for instance, or that it should be treating us fairly, or that it should at least be protecting us from pain. I call it an illusion because the unpleasant fact is that life owes us none of these things. In reality, life owes us nothing, not even what would sustain our existence through the next hour. And the idea that life should owe us something is really only a wishful fantasy we fabricated that has nothing at all to do with life's actual reality. And so I'd say that a big part of existential forgiveness has to do with letting go of that wishful sense of indebtedness. And when we're able to do that, when we're able to forgive life for being what it is, despite all of its agony and travail, well, all of a sudden it also gets a lot easier to forgive other people for being what they are. Okay, so let's move toward ending this video by summarizing those 3 ways of learning to forgive when it's a good idea to do so. First, instead of resting easily in the fantasy of our own quasi-moral superiority, if we really want to learn to forgive, it's a good idea to make a practice of honestly recognizing our own faults and shortcomings, which in turn can make it much easier for us to forgive other people's failings. Second, instead of indulging in judgmentalism, it's a good idea to understand other people, especially by making an effort to see things from their perspective as best we can. That's because understanding generally makes it much easier to forgive others than judgmentalism does. And finally, instead of nursing the illusion that life owes us something and needs to pay up, it's a good idea to learn the subtle art of existential forgiveness, which would involve allowing life to be what it is, and allowing ourselves to experience it exactly as it is. In any case, it's probably evident at this point that the road of forgiveness is actually fairly long and rocky, with plenty of potential places for stumbling along the way. And traveling that road actually requires a fair amount of discernment and honest self-reflection. All in all, I'd say that learning to perceive when it's strategically right to forgive someone and when it's not And then learning how to let go of our lingering resentments honestly and directly is really one of life's great avenues for personal growth and transformation. Sure, it can definitely be a daunting challenge. But isn't that true of a lot of things in life that are genuinely worthwhile? And at the end of the day, isn't it worthwhile, and I would say even ecstatically liberating, to learn to let go of the onerous weight of our past animosities and resentments, especially when there's nothing we can do about them anyhow? But beyond all of that, isn't it an incredible thing to grow personally to the point where we can learn to be a little bit more perceptive about ourselves and about life's demands, and to engage the world with a much greater sense of generosity, where who we are and what we really have to offer can pour forth easily and fluidly? But hell, don't take my word for it. Go out there and see how it works for you. You're allowed to be playful and experimental during this lifetime. Just a thought. Anyhow, thanks as always for watching, and as always, take care of your soul.